order. Welcome, everybody. Can we have a round of introductions, please? Pierre, do you want to start?
Pierre Tong, Bicycle Planning Committee.
Susan Hatchell, Pedestrian Committee.
Liz Hester, new committee member.
Dwight Otwell, Bicycle Planning.
Mary Sal, Chair.
I am Robert Parrish. I'm on the Pedestrian Committee.
Elizabeth Alley, Pedestrian Committee.
Paul Neville, Outreach Committee.
Kelly with a Pedestrian Committee.
Eric Lamb, City Staff.
Fontaine Burris, City Staff.
B-person city staff.
Looks like we have Nick coming up too.
Neptune.
He's look.
Nick Neptune.
We're a full house tonight, Nick.
Good evening.
Well, it takes a party to get us on here, right?
Could you provide a quick introduction just for the record?
Oh my God.
Just your name. And
Nick
your
Neptune,
committee.
Commissioner.
And actually, if we could start out today by doing a quick moment of silence for Todd Delk, who is a very important member of the bicycling community and of Raleigh in general. Really special guy. Just a moment of silence, please. Thank you. Our first protective facility out there, that's for Todd, huh? We'll name it after him. All right. Could I get approval of the minutes from the previous meeting?
I move for approval.
A second.
Okay. Now an opportunity for public comments. Oh, sorry.
Aye.
And a second.
A second.
Kelly second.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, say all in favor.
Oh, thanks. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Awesome. Public comment? Anybody out there have anything they'd like to share? All right, staff reports.
Don't have much to report at this time. The one introduced Liz Hester, who is your newest appointee by the City Council. She was appointed to replace Rebecca Proudfoot, and we're just delighted to see all 10 seats filled this evening. So thank you all very much. Anything?
Also, the North Carolina Museum of Art station got installed today.
Well done.
Farmers Market coming later this week.
So we're down to our last 4 stations to be installed with bike share. We're closing in on finishing that project very soon. And then I'll be happy to answer any questions on specific projects that you have at this time.
I had a question about the blunt person. I know there's been a few wrinkles with like the sinkhole and stuff. Is there an updated timeline for that then, for the whole project, or?
So at this point, you are correct that as a direct result of our milling, and this is actually, in the world of infrastructure, it is a good problem that we discovered this now as part of this process, as opposed to when it could have collapsed and caused a more serious issue. And we caught it while we were doing this resurfacing work, which means we didn't go in and spend this money and do the resurfacing and then for the sinkhole to show itself later.
Right.
So it's taking lemons and making lemonade, I suppose. But our public utility staff has gotten involved on working on that replacement. It ended up being a fairly extensive amount of piping that had to be replaced. Our understanding now is that the road will reopen at the end of October.
Okay.
So we've got a couple more weeks of that. And then things should normalize. I know that we're very sensitive to the fact that it has displaced some traffic. We've heard a lot of feedback from folks in Mordecai and Oakwood about drivers trying to navigate their way through the neighborhood in an unacceptable manner. So we remind everybody that as you're driving through neighborhoods to drive like you live there and your children live there. So it was a double whammy that we, as far as in the afternoons, you have the Peace Street ramp at Capitol that's also closed, and Wake Forest was part of that detour route. So it's something of a perfect storm as far as how this has all come together, but we'll be seeing some relief soon.
Okay. I have a few others. I don't know if anybody else has.
Knock yourself out.
Gorman Street update timeline for that?
Do not have an updated timeline. That project is moving towards letting for construction. We received our construction authorization from NCDOT, which was a big benchmark for us.
Okay. So we're still anticipating that will get implemented with the federal dollars and
be open by next year.
Okay.
The minutes last month noted that solicited bids in the fall, construction starting in the spring.
Yep.
Correct? Still on schedule.
Okay. And then was curious, I think I just received an update from staff on the timeline for the Harrington Street. You guys are going to potentially have some public outreach happening in the next few months, it sounds like.
Correct.
Okay. I had one question about Campo projects. Are you all submitting any to be considered there? And if so, would you be able to share what those projects are?
Absolutely. We've got a complete breakdown. So we, for everyone's benefit, CAMPO is the Capital Area Metropolitan Planning Organization, and so they oversee the distribution of certain types of federal funds that are directly allocated through MPOs across North Carolina. And we also submit projects through the MPO to go into NCDOT's Transportation Improvement Program, which is where all of the state's highway and railway spending dollars pass through. And the MPOs are a gateway for municipalities to submit projects to DOT. So with the projects that we have submitted for this round, they go up against other projects that are in our region and get prioritized based on NCDOT's funding formulas now. So
Okay.
but I'd be happy to share with you the projects that we have put
Sure.
into that pipeline.
Okay, that'd be great. That's all I got. All right, staff reports, you've already done all those. Chair's report, I attended the bicycle subcommittee just now, and we had some great discussions there. I'll let Dwight provide the basis of that update. And also had an opportunity to attend the community outreach subcommittee, which was held a few weeks ago at Transfer. We did have somebody from the public come and attend that, which was great to see. Just continuing to think about different ways that we can provide outreach to the community. I have a question too about, sometimes we will get project updates when we know that there's going to be a project brought out into the community. Do you know how, I saw that there was one for the Atlantic project that we had talked about, but I didn't have it on my radar in time. Is there a way for us to, one, is there a project page for the city that like has encapsulates like all of those meetings that we could reference for transportation?
Not a specific meeting page like a calendar of events, no.
Right.
But what I encourage everyone to do is to go on the city's webpage and sign up for updates. And one of the things that you can get is our engineering department puts out regular updates about projects, and you can
Okay.
sign up for those updates.
Okay,
But we do try and push those out whenever we can. I apologize
Right.
that we did
Oh,
not
no
push
big
them
deal.
out earlier.
okay. Bicycle planning committee?
So we met earlier today, but the report should officially be from our meeting from last month. So last month, we met with Mila and the Go Triangle crew and the representatives from Tool Design. Is that correct? If I'm wrong. And we discussed how we were going to prioritize and coordinate bicycle corridors and separated facilities with the downtown transportation plan. And we have scheduled a series of meetings where we'll discuss priorities for the corridors, and within each corridor, priorities for the kind of facility we would like to see. This will be an ongoing discussion. We continued it again today. And as a brief overview of what we talked about today, we had a nice overview of the Citrix share and the update on the bike use, which we will provide a full report on next month. And we have decided to implement an ad hoc committee to discuss the downtown transportation plan and the bicycle corridor prioritization. Is this a good time to bring up that motion and talk about that?
We would need to make a motion for that, correct?
Technically, no. The chair can appoint an ad hoc committee unilaterally.
Okay,
So the bicycle planning committee voted to move the discussion, particularly of the downtown transportation plan, to the ad hoc committee, which our chair will be implementing presently.
so I just have to say like, make an ad hoc committee?
Who's on it?
All right. Let it be so.
Can anybody attend this meeting?
Yes.
or-
Yeah, can you tell us who's on that committee, please?
Oh,
It's not
I'm just winging it, y'all.
The so part.
Anybody who would like to be on the committee can certainly be on that committee. I can send out to the entire commission the dates. Is that correct? Or would that be, should I send those to you and you send those out to the committee? Or how should I handle sending it out to multiple folks?
You will name a chair of the ad hoc committee,
Okay.
and then whoever the other members are on the committee, and then we'll work with the chair to get
I'm
that
making
scheduled.
you the chair.
I would be happy to serve as chair.
Okay, and
I-
then,
I also think that Elizabeth would make a good choice for that.
can you guys want to co-chair?
Sure, let's
All right.
do it. All modes covered.
Okay. And then anybody who wants to join is able to join.
So speak up now, please.
Or I have to say who, well, it might be contingent on availabilities. Oh, wow, look at, we got a whole party.
Very good.
Okay, that's great.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Did you capture everybody? And I would also like to be on that.
I
As-
would
as
like
the
to
chair,
attend,
you're
but I-
automatically a member of all committees.
Okay.
So, and then what is the name of this committee? This ad hoc committee?
Downtown plan?
The Downtown Plan Committee, yeah.
Downtown plan.
Yeah, I would like to attend those, but it would not be appropriate for me to be on the committee.
Okay. Community outreach, would you like to provide an update? Nick, I think you're probably the best point of contact for that tonight. You've been promoted.
I'm happy to provide an update on our outreach committee meeting, though I would like to acknowledge that I did not prepare remarks in advance, given that I was not aware of being suddenly appointed.
Well,
tonight.
Rebecca used to be the head of that committee, and she is no longer on the commission. So as the other participant of that committee, you have been promoted.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, I would just say that, it was a pleasure to have our chairwoman, Mary Sell, in attendance. I believe that Fontaine Burris was also with us that evening on behalf of city staff. And we also had in attendance a surprise but most welcome guest from the public who I think heard about the meeting just through
Her friend or something.
a friend, through the internet, something along those lines. But but that's part of the point, right? In having hosted the event very deliberately, outside of a city office. I mean, it was out in a public space, and it was, I think, again, a nice surprise to have a member of the public show up and attend and have their own, I think, concerns that they related to us. I think it was related to the 5 Points area, if I'm not mistaken. But separate from that, I think it was a good meeting to discuss, our concerns, our objectives, sort of moving forward, really, is what I recall, moving forward on behalf of the Outreach Committee. In the interest of time, I'm going to keep my remarks limited and abbreviated to that, because that's what I really do recall, primarily from the meeting. And I think that we may have discussed some upcoming Walktober-related events. I know that I had the pleasure and privilege of seeing and attending a number of events this month with our Chairwoman Mary Sell and Fontaine. In fact, had a really good occasion, kind of just out on behalf of BPAC and on behalf of as a member of the community, really engaging with a number of folks over the weekend who made comment about having attended the event at Hunter Elementary School in particular, which was like a larger sort of Walktober and sort of walk to school celebration, as well as a moment to encourage physical fitness, I think, amongst the kids and their families. And anyways, like I said, I will limit the comments to that and say that I thought it was a good meeting and look forward to having more, whether it be, off campus at the food hall or the work hall or elsewhere. I think that, again, on behalf of the Outreach Committee, deliberately hosting our committee meetings off-site is a good idea, and we were certainly witness to it day one. So thank you.
Awesome.
Where did you meet?
Well, we basically met at Transfer Company Food Hall.
Oh, okay.
But within the food hall, we recently opened up a co-working space, sort of what we call the work hall. And so we actually had a meeting space within the food hall that we were able to receive, our visitor, as well as receive the invited guests for the Outreach Committee.
It was my neighbor who was at the meeting. She told me about coming to see you.
Oh,
All
well,
right.
how
Susan's
about
the
that?
friend.
Finally,
Found the
I'm
friend.
over here just in the dark. Like, I don't know who that woman was.
Yeah, no. She
all
she
makes
found
sense.
she
Yeah.
found the connection. I didn't have it.
Yeah, well,
told
she
me
was so
found it.
nice.
Oh,
she
she was thrilled to have been there.
And I think we invited her to come back, and I mean, she was
Come on
great.
down.
She was on it. I just remember I loved it. Thank you.
And the pedestrian planning committee. I'm
I want
sorry.
to add one other comment for the Outreach Committee. We have had interest from the Sister City program to have a person from that group come present to the outreach committee as part of some type of a bicycling event, either with the sister city in the foreign country or a group coming from that country over to Raleigh. So we do have that potential in the future. And I also want to point out that in the past, outreach committee, as part of its charter, had tried to meet at various community centers around Raleigh, since there's so many nice ones. And so this is a good continuation of our attempts to be out in the community talking to them about our charter and our advocacy.
And if I may, just for a moment, I love that and would be happy to, I guess I've been appointed chair of the outreach committee
Well,
now.
we
Or
can
maybe,
probably
am I
have
the only member of the outreach committee?
in the interim at least. I mean, yeah.
I mean, I guess what I'm trying to acknowledge is that I'm happy to take that on
Okay.
officially.
Yes.
And happy to move forward in deliberately hosting and organizing our outreach committee meetings, off-site and across the community as a part of its mission. I'm very happy to do that.
And Nick, I'll continue to be on the committee.
Oh, thank you so much.
I'm sorry.
Really?
I should
I was
apologize.
absent last month, I'm sorry.
Since you weren't there, I blocked in my mind, since it's the first community outreach meeting I had attended as chair. Should we move on to the pedestrian update?
Sure. We had a productive meeting last week. We heard from staff about the Martin Street Safety Audit Walk, which was part of Walktober, and it was really productive. It took about exactly an hour, which means that it could be easily replicable on other streets downtown. It was really illuminating, I think, to look at the details of how a street is built. And along those lines, we had a conversation about perhaps a future partnership for an event. This was Robert's mastermind, a partnership with the Wake Federation for the Blind, and the potential for us to do a collaborative event, potentially out on the street, maybe cross some intersections together, and invite some folks. So details TBD, but I thought that was a fun idea and wanted to bring it to the full group. Do you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, well, the thought is to see where needed audible signals need to go, particularly on Dawson, at the corner of Dawson and Hargett, and then, what's that street I mentioned to you? McDowell and Hargett. They don't have any audible signals, and so we would like to cross those streets with city officials to see how dangerous it really is without an audible signal. Also, we could also test some of the sidewalks downtown as well as we collaborate and walk together. So more details will be forthcoming as we will contact city officials, including the staff here.
Formally invited.
That's right. So an early concept, and so hopefully we won't wait till next Walktober, but I think an idea that maybe we need to collaborate with the outreach committee.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Nick. And then the final item that we discussed was I believe the entire commission has received emails from Vince Whitehurst with some questions and comments about pedestrian detours and to a lesser extent bicycle detours around construction sites. And we looked at the city's handbook on those and just wanted to, if it's okay with everybody, to put that on our standing work item, just to understand how that is being implemented and where the levels are for when you do a full detour or not, and to what extent. So a great handbook, just want to understand how it's being used. And that's the end of my report. Thank you.
Fantastic. Okay, I was gonna wait until the board comments, since I forgot to do this earlier, Susan, but we wanted to tell you that we really appreciate you. And you are getting this fancy plaque that you can put somewhere fancy.
Thank you. How sweet. Thank you. Oh, it's lovely. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks. I need nudges from time to time up here, so I really appreciate that, Eric. Thank you. Could we move on to the Midtown St. Albans plan? Jason, would you like to come up and present?
All right. Hey, good evening, everybody. I'm Jason Harden with the City Planning Department, and I am the project manager for the Midtown Small Area Plan, which we've been working on, and several of you have participated in at some point or another for the last year or so. Getting close to the finish line, and wanted to share with you where this project is at. I think it's unique in some ways, so it's what we call a small area plan, although it's in fact kind of a large area. But compared to a lot of these, it does include some land use, but a lot of the focus is on transportation and particularly on bicycle and pedestrian issues. That's something that we've heard about pretty consistently through that process as something that people have a hunger for in this area to see improve. So I'm gonna just kind of run through what we have, and we'll leave some room for questions at the end, but want to give you pretty much the breadth of what the plan is looking at, and some projects that I hope, y'all will probably come back in front of you in coming years. So just where we're at in terms of the process, we started last summer with some, how's the volume on this? Am I good? Great. Okay. It's a little different than usual. So wanted to make sure I wasn't blasting y'all. So we started last summer with a visioning exercise, wanted to understand. We knew to some degree that folks were interested in transportation in this area, particularly as North Hills continues to grow and evolve. There were questions about what does that transportation demand look like in the future. Also stormwater, land use, a lot of other concerns in the area. But again and again, the theme came back to transportation, and especially active transportation. Went through a couple more phases where increasingly we built on what we learned and what we heard, and put out ideas that responded to the issues and opportunities that we heard about. Where we are right now is close to the end, so we just wrapped up our last survey and set of meetings on this. So we're gonna take that input, a lot of input, 300 responses on the survey, digest that, and then create a final report, which we'll publish in the coming month or two. Have some additional comments on that report, because you'll have everything there together so people can see where it's headed and the context and how it got there, and then deliver that to council early next year. So backing up just a little bit, so everybody has probably their own mental map of Midtown, but this is what we looked at as far as the study area. So North Hills here in the southern part, that was a big part of what drove the creation of the study in the first place, but it does extend all the way up to Millbrook Road in the north, Six Forks on the west, Atlantic on the east, and then Six Forks and the Crabtree Creek on the south. And so this is just a little snapshot of how we started out. And what I really want to talk about as far as what we heard from the public, and we duplicated this a couple times. This was the first survey that we did, and we got this same result more than once. We asked what were the top issues that people wanted to see this plan address. Number one, safety, comfort for people walking or bicycling. So there's a lot of destinations in the area. There's North Hills, there's the Crabtree Greenway, and the trouble is there's a lot of things in the way. There's 440, there's some very wide and very busy arterials. So people really, really, really would like to do more walking and biking than they can feel like they can safely and reasonably do right now. So that was really a central question, issue that this plan addressed over the last year or so. And we took that input, got some more, boiled it down into a set of planning principles, and I'll call your attention particularly to the number one, called it Midtown Moves, and a focus on, this is all about transportation, walkability, safety. We talked about reliability, not necessarily being able to drive through here faster. One, just probably not realistic, and two, more fundamentally, not necessarily desirable when we're talking about creating a safer place to be and creating a place. And for a long time, Midtown and a lot of Raleigh outside of downtown was less a place than a place to go through to some other place. It's emerging as a place, and therefore there wasn't a priority on getting through here faster. Did look at reliability and avoiding, say, the worst conditions for all modes. And then adding travel options was a big one, whether that's transit, walking, driving, whatever. I'll touch on the other ones, but the plan also did look at expanding options for housing and employment in the area. Respecting existing residential neighborhoods was a pretty key theme. One that we called Midtown Green and Blue, so there are lots of waterways in the area and natural spaces, and preserving, enhancing those, using them in a couple ways, improving stormwater retention abilities, but also as transportation nodes and public spaces in the area. And I'll illustrate a little bit later what I mean by some of those ways that they can do more than one thing at a time, these natural places. And then aesthetics, thinking about more attractive places, public spaces, streetscapes. So there's a lot to the plan, and we don't have the final report available yet, again, next month or so. But that said, if you wanted to understand it in a glance or two, then what I'm calling these 7 big moves, and this is what we tested in the last round of input, got a lot of positive support on these. If you understand these, you basically understand the intent of the plan and what it would do in the coming years to transform the area. So number one, what we're calling Beltline Crossing, which is a new bicycle and pedestrian and car facility across 440 in the heart of Midtown, so that you have all of a sudden a connection that's safe and comfortable for people walking or biking in a way that it isn't right now on Six Forks or Wake Forest or Atlantic, and I can keep going to the east. You probably got to get to Raleigh Boulevard before you have something that's reasonable. So that fills a big gap. Also, in terms of driving, it avoids the situation we have right now where essentially all trips are forced to either Wake Forest and 440 or Six Forks and 440 when they don't necessarily need to go through there or want to go through there. So second one, what we're calling green streets, and that's taking some existing residential streets that are pretty wide, tend to have some high speeds, especially on a downhill, and looking at ways to, again, do triple duty there. So can retain some stormwater with some impervious surface, can slow down the cars going through here, and can provide some, essentially an on-street greenway, safer place for people biking or walking as well. A connected street network, it's very fragmented in this area. You compare it to not just downtown, but lots of other neighborhoods in the city, and you've got 440 and you've got a couple other streets, and that's it. And that leads to a lot of the issues that we experience in that area. What I'm calling serious transit, obviously there's transit in the area. None of it is frequent, none of it is 15 minutes or less, but a plan for multiple routes connecting Midtown and other parts of the city at that frequent frequency. Then finally adding some of these bicycle and pedestrian facilities together, you get what we've been calling the Midtown Ring, which is in pieces it's greenway, in pieces it's high quality on-street facilities. It is basically a connected network of safe, comfortable facilities to get to all parts of Midtown, residential neighborhoods, shopping, North Hills, Greenway, across 440 in a way that you can't right now. Also, some look at land use in a couple of key locations in the area. It's a big area, so not really looking at that everywhere. And then a Midtown waterfront district, which I'll show you a little bit more about in a moment. So I went through those pretty quickly, and I'm going to go through these quickly too. And again, I'm going to leave time for questions at the end. This is just a look at a little bit more specifically where the bridge would go. So there's the office park here on one side of 440, and then the future development in North Hills there on the north side. So that's generally speaking where it looks like that connection would be feasible. And there's a little rendering of what it could look like. What it would probably feel like is pretty similar to Lassiter Mill Road, where you have 2 lanes of traffic and some I think pretty comfortable facilities for people walking or biking across. Could be a little bit more generous here, but that's a pretty good precedent. So the green streets, a couple of examples of what that could look like. Some on-street stormwater infrastructure that also serves as protection for people walking. So again, almost an on-street greenway. A greenway connection, so using those green streets, and then there will be a greenway connection through the future North Hills phase, and then looking at, unfortunately, we weren't able to quite nail down the best route. I think that's going to take a little bit more work with parks and y'all and bicycle planners as to exactly the best way to get down to the Crabtree. Would it be more of an on-street connection, or this one has the benefit of not being on street, but a little bit more complex in terms of the topography and some of the connections that it would have to make. So another look at the Midtown Ring and the different types of facilities that could be a part of that. And I should mention here, I talked about one bridge here, but actually the plan calls for 2. Second one would be just a bicycle and pedestrian crossing. And that would connect the area where the Wegmans grocery store is, and that's an area south of 440 where a significant amount of redevelopment is anticipated in the coming years, connecting that to the north where you have the Wake Tech campus and a lot of older office industrial uses here that are probably likely in coming years to see some changes as well. Connected street network, there's a lot of opportunities either through development or in some cases through some city projects to create those connections where they don't currently exist. Extending Six Forks to Capitol is one, Waketown is another. There's a few other fragments, also connecting Navajo Drive to North Hills. So creating a grid where it does not really exist in any meaningful form right now. The waterfront district, so that is, right now you might call it the car dealership district. That is along Wake Forest, and I would say the two things that characterize that the most would be, well, parked cars and flooding, and an opportunity to rethink that in a pretty significant way in the coming years. So a lot of that area right now is in the floodplain. So looking at some possibilities for creating some, possibly over time, some public space that would also do significant stormwater duty. I talk about how a lot of these projects can do more than one thing at a time, and this would be an opportunity to really make a difference in a couple of respects. So a public space right now where it doesn't exist. So right now, this part of Midtown, I think the city has turned its back on it for some time, but you've got a lot of elements there to do something big. You've got a greenway, you've got a waterfront, and you've got an area that is seeing a lot of redevelopment, not just the Wegmans, but some other projects. So a place where ultimately all that can come together and you have what we don't have very much of, if at all, in Raleigh, which is an urban walkable place with some public spaces next to some water. And ultimately that's the goal that I think is actually pretty reasonable to achieve given some of the conditions that are already in place in this area. So I talked about the transit, multiple routes in the first phase that would be frequent, 15 minutes or less, and then a phase 2 which looks at bus rapid transit. Of course, there's a lot of planning for that happening right now, not connecting here yet, but the phase 2 would explore some possibilities for connecting bus rapid transit in the right place to do that, to get to Midtown in the future. There's some land use recommendations, and I do want to pause for a second and say that all this and a little bit more is all on the project page for this. If you go to the city's website and type in Midtown, you'll get there. But there's a couple, I've mentioned this a couple times, a couple places where we've got some industrial or older office uses in the plan along Wake Forest Road and St. Albans Road. Plan is encouraging more housing in those locations. And then a couple places where it's providing some guidance on height. So here's Six Forks, and then where the bridge would connect across 440, looking at height guidance there. So 20 stories closer to the belt line and then transitioning down to 3 stories along Six Forks. And then also along that waterfront area, looking at some housing and encouraging that in that area as well, because there's a lot of retail, obviously, right now. A couple other projects, St. Albans Drive, including the city's plans already envision this as being a 2-lane divided, so some median and some turning lanes and stretches. Also looking at the possibility of a multi-use path along here. Some improvements to some intersections on Wake Forest Road, at Navajo and at St. Albans Drive. This is a little bit more on the moving vehicles side of the plan, and heard a lot from the hospital about concerns they have with access, and that's responding to some of those concerns. A Six Forks pedestrian, it's a bridge. This could still possibly be a tunnel. That's a little bit undecided. This was one of the biggest questions or desires that emerged from the public input that we did. There's not a really obvious engineering solution to that yet, so I think it takes a little bit more thought, but that's one where people really have a desire to see a safer connection right there at North Hills across Six Forks. And I don't want to blow by these too quickly because while they're small and didn't necessarily get a lot of attention in the plan, they're kind of significant. So there's several places where we have some actually informal trails or connections already. So this is Bush Street. we have a neighborhood here. There's no formal street connections between the neighborhood and Bush, but there's some walkways that obviously people are using. And as Bush would be a key part of that Midtown ring, we want to make it easy to access that. So formalizing those connections and making them ADA compliant. Right now you couldn't really use them in that way, so that would be a key improvement. And in several locations, especially, but not only along Millbrook Road, some conditions where it's pretty hard to cross. And if you'll recall, I showed you the Green Street concept with an on-street greenway going up Quail Hollow to Millbrook. Well, presumably people up here also would probably like to take advantage of that, which means it needs to be safe and comfortable to cross Millbrook. So looking at ways where we can improve that existing condition right now. So that's pretty quick, and I would love to go back if there's questions about any specific project that I mentioned or anything in general. Would love to have any questions or comments that you have.
I've got a couple. First of all, the Greenway connection would follow Big Branch Creek. Is that correct? The existing creekway
So
under the freeway?
it would probably go actually over, it would be part of that bridge ultimately when it crossed over.
Okay, so it would connect to the Navajo connector bridge.
That's right.
Which would do the same thing. And also, I believe there's a very good online survey, which I took. I think it was due to complete this week.
It did, it closed on Sunday.
Good response did you get? Do you have any idea?
Yeah, so just took a look at that this morning, more than 300 responses, which I think is pretty robust for this area. I felt really good about that level of input. So the survey, for those of you who didn't see it, it asked people to prioritize these different projects. And they were given, if you took the survey, you were given 25, we called them Midtown bucks. So for $3 you could get a bridge across 440 or a waterfront park. But the trick was, once you got to $25, that was it. And so you couldn't have everything you wanted, which is kind of like real life. And we used it, ultimately, I hope all these projects can happen, because I think there's a lot of rationale for them and a lot of public support for all of them. But it was a way, if you don't prioritize anything, then you don't, where do you start? So a way of setting some priorities. And some of those would be determined by what's feasible in the short run as far as funding, and some projects would have to come after others. But I think that input that we got is going to be really helpful in understanding, again, people's priorities for the area.
I have a question. Go ahead, Robert.
Well, my question is sort of an overarching question, not directly related to the plans that you've stated, but can you say anything about, you mentioned the rapid transit in connecting with St. Albans and so forth. Has anybody done a survey to see who would actually, would the ridership with that rapid transit?
Mm-hmm. So we asked that question pretty specifically in a couple of surveys, and honestly, people didn't prioritize that as much as they did some of the pedestrian and bicycle projects. And I don't know if that's because we didn't reach as broad of a demographic cross-section as we would have hoped. I don't know if it's the existing residents in the area, because you don't have very frequent transit, they're less likely to be using it right now than along some of the corridors where BRT is planned and we do have higher ridership. But we did ask that question. There is definitely some support for it, but projecting ridership gets pretty tough. It's lower here than it is on some of the corridors where BRT is planned, but we can see what that looks like in the future once we increase the frequency of those routes that are already serving the area.
Okay.
And right now, there are multiple corridors in the Wake Transit Plan that are not bus rapid transit, but they're the high-frequency network for the city, and multiple routes converge at North Hill, so it's very strategic and important as part of the overall transit network. So we have a number of services that are going to continue to increase service in this total area.
My question was about planned development, specifically about block sizes. I know that it is complicated when you're retrofitting suburban corridors that back up to single-family neighborhoods, but our UDO would tell you that you create blocks of a certain scale that are connected to those streets. Not always, depending, but wondering if that is something that you all broached in your planning and looking at how these kind of major mixed-use buildings weave into the neighborhood. And if you looked at the block dimensions, like I'm just looking at it on the map, and they're still big. Smaller certainly is more connected than it is now. But thinking what it would be like if you brought one of these projects in today, it would actually be hard to get it permitted because it would require a smaller block.
Yes, although sometimes during that process, someone
Get a
requests
design adjustment,
a
yeah,
modification
sure.
to those block standards, which are really helpful in
Yeah.
establishing that kind of walkable
Absolutely.
grid.
Yeah, I mean, I'm all for a nice connected grid. I just didn't know if that was something that might have gotten any pushback from the community or concern. I know that you certainly talked about transitions in scale. I saw that in one of the slides, but I didn't know what the sentiment was about actually connecting, because you have a
Right.
lot of cul-de-sacs that back up to big roads.
There's a lot, and that's always a tough conversation. Frankly, most of the connections that you see on the slide that shows the future connections, those are in areas that are more commercial
Okay.
in nature.
Yeah, I didn't notice a lot of residential streets
Yeah.
connecting to one another.
That's right. So it did focus more on that. We did have conversation about one in particular that may fit this example. So it was essentially connecting Wake Forest behind the hospital. And you almost have a situation where you have a connected network there. There's literally less than probably 100 feet where there's not quite a connection. So we put that out there as an option and got some feedback on it. It was very, very negative.
Okay.
And so that option ultimately did not make it through to
Yeah.
these final options at the
I
end.
think, that's the challenge, I would imagine, is that you will have immediately impacted neighbors, right, who might fear it, but it is also like a network that serves a broader constituent base.
That's right. But
Thank
I
you
would
for studying it.
I would say, though, that the areas where, and I'll bring the other slide up that shows the network, the areas where some additional connectivity is envisioned are the areas where the demand is highest, both for vehicles and I think for pedestrian connectivity as well. So I think if we get
For
something
people
even
going,
close
yeah.
to that level of network, that's going to be a pretty significant improvement in the area.
Yeah, big leap forward. Great.
I'd like to thank Jason, who showed up at the Midtown CAC meetings diligently every night of the month for a year or more, and gave very similar presentations many times as the project moved on, and was very responsive to the questions and just very diligent. So thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Dwight.
Can I echo that thanks? Just,
Slow clap for Jason.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. Round
We
of
really
applause
like
for
this.
Jason.
This is great.
Well, and I mean that. I guess, this is my first time really hearing a plan like this, or I guess maybe the conclusions from a study like this. I'm very new to all of this, so pardon me. I'm sure this is like normal for everybody else. But I think my point is that I appreciate the work that went into this on behalf of the planning department with the city of Raleigh, number one. And then number two, there's a follow-up question. Are there any current or upcoming studies or plans kind of along these lines happening right now?
Yeah, there are a couple, and Eric probably will add a couple as more. So the biggest one that comes to my mind is a study for Capitol Boulevard in between 440 and 540. That's another project that is looking at a similar area in terms of the fact that it's older, suburban. It was originally built for the automobile, and it's going to continue to be a major corridor in the future, but looking at ways to improve it for transit and for pedestrian safety and comfort. That's the one I would mention first and foremost. Eric may have some others in mind as well.
During the budgeting process this year, the city council added in 2 additional studies, one for Wakefield up in the north part of Raleigh, and then Old East, which is just east of downtown. So, and then the way that these types of studies work normally is that we go through and develop a study with the community on these sub areas or these corridors, and then the outcomes of these studies are ultimately inculcated into the city's comprehensive plan. And in some cases, they have their own chapters. In some cases, it's individual components that are added into the city's various infrastructure planning maps.
And then eventually into the CIP.
And then
road construction?
projects move forward as all the area plans and all the needs across the city are all looked at, and we look at trying to fund projects from individual plans and move those forward through our capital improvement program.
Which is
Thank
the next
you.
agenda item.
I was going to say, we would see some of those come into fruition in our streetscape discussion, correct, that we're about to move into. So you'll see the components of these plans get integrated into funding mechanisms, more or less, and implementation strategies, even though those are very long as well. 'Cause, I mean, that's my main thing I'm thinking about is like, I'm very eager to see these things get implemented.
Me too.
And it always, yeah, I know, right? So it just comes back to how do we continue to think through how we are communicating with the public so people don't have fatigue, I think, too, with these, because I think people get really excited about the byproducts of these types of really robust efforts. And how are we helping people to remain positively engaged as a stakeholder in this process as it, moves its way down its bureaucratic line, et cetera.
That's a good question. One thing that we have not done yet, but that I have been thinking more and more about, and probably will look to put in place with Midtown, is after the project wraps up, to not just leave it at that and then whatever happens, happens, but come back, especially to the community, to the CAC and anybody else who participated, and just give them an update.
Yeah.
Where do things stand, and do you have questions or different perspectives, a year out from, or 2 years? So to kind of keep the conversation going and not just say, okay, the plan's done and that's it.
Jason,
But keep the conversation alive.
is there not, when people show up, or I guess have been showing up to all these various meetings, some sort of documentation of emails and et cetera, again, based on the folks who were actually there? Because I would think there must be a mechanism to just sort of send out like an email blast of like, here's the update on the project kind of moving forward.
Yeah, we do have a list of all emails for people who have showed up or taken the survey. So that would be a good way to update people in the future as well, definitely.
To Mary's point, it would be lovely to see, as you all write the implementation chapter of this, to think about like temporary urbanism and kind of pilot projects and ways that we might be able to sustain the enthusiasm and momentum as we move towards what I'm best guessing is some really substantial capital outlays, worthy ones, but it's a long list. So maybe there's some ways for us to dip our toe in.
Yeah, how can we be more agile with iterative steps and ongoing
And
conversation?
the other thing that's really important about these plans, that even if we don't spend another dollar of public money, that it shapes the private investment. And that's really important as it relates to infrastructure, that as we set these land use parameters and we set these grids, that as the private development comes in, that we're able to capitalize through partnerships or through exactions on those projects.
I'm currently working on a project where the Blue Ridge Road study was, where we were building 3 new roads because of that project. So whatever.
It really
Eric is
does
saying is
happen,
correct.
guys.
It's a partnership.
Yeah, I'd like to direct a comment to the chair. In the audience is Mr. Alan Wiggs, former chair of the BPAC, who brought forward an exact idea along these lines to the very first BPAC meeting in October 2009. I'd like to see if we could entertain a comment from him.
I attended at least one workshop, and I really enjoyed the workshop. The only question I have looking at it now is concern on high-speed rail and what this is going to do to the eastern side of this whole project, because when that comes in, I know New Hope's going to get redone, Wolfpack's probably going to be cut off, so we lose some of the grid on the eastern side of this whole layout, and I don't remember seeing that in some of the discussion. I'm sorry to be late in the project.
No, it's a good question, and actually, this probably shows about 80% of the final product. So there's a couple of topics I didn't get into, and that's one of them. So there are grade separation projects on Wolfpack and New Hope and Pacific ultimately. So that's going to be something that happens down the road. I think that still preserves the grid, and probably you get a safety improvement compared to the at-grade crossing that you have now. I don't think there would be any that are just cut off and then you have 2 separated. I think we're going to add to the connectivity. In terms of land use, I do think that rail is going to have some effects in the future. It's a little far out to start to assume that that's going to happen and recommend changes based on it specifically. But I think if or when that project starts to become more imminent and more predictable in terms of a timeline, that's something we would probably go back and take a look at. And honestly, I see this as a project where probably the refresh is a little bit quicker than in some other area plans. It might be 10 years, we come back, because the area is changing pretty rapidly, and we'll say, okay, wow, we got a lot of this right. There's a few things that we didn't anticipate, need to take another look at. Maybe some things that weren't even on the radar today, and in 2028 look a little bit different. So I think this is one, and rail is a really good example, but probably not the only example of why we'd probably want a quicker turnaround to take a look at this again in the future.
And then the other comment I want to mention to the BPAC is some of us locally, I think Dwight might have been involved. We fought pretty long and hard with a couple of developers, Kane and also the DeWitt properties, about having and making sure they maintain a 10-foot minimum sidewalk down the entire St. Albans, and also maintain the bike lanes. So just as you guys, when this comes a little further along, you know, keep your eyes on the ground to make sure that suddenly somebody goes, bike lanes are gone. So no, it's not, that was part of the negotiation, the bike lane stay and a 10-foot sidewalk. It might be an opportunity to do a separated bike facility, maybe a sidewalk and a bike thing. I leave it up to the professionals that know how to do the layout, but that might be a nice change for that area. Other areas where you have a sidewalk and then you have a bicycle facility, just something to think about. We'll have enough roadway. It's just talking to the developer and the city to make sure everybody gets the striping correct or whatever. It'll be a nice feel in St. Albans, but thank you.
Another question over here? No.
We have an unconventional meeting today because we have a reunion after this, so. Should we keep moving on because we turned into pumpkin at 7:30? Yeah, okay. Thank you so much. We really enjoyed this, and we will continue to stay plugged in with the effort.
Definitely, thank you.
Thank you. All right, it's the Jason show tonight.
You just made your list longer.
Okay. So in your agenda materials, in your agenda packet are all those things. A couple of handouts. At your last meeting, you told us that you liked the prioritization, which is in there. There's no change to that. So we had come up with a scoring system, and we presented last time, it does seem like, a series of projects that we were going to score, and you said you wanted to see those scores, so now we have those scores. So there is actually two different handouts if you've got it printed, or if you don't, an 8.5 by 11 that is a list of the projects and their scopes with their score, and they're in rank order of that score. The highest ranking project, or highest scoring project down to the lowest scoring project. If you want to get into the weeds of the details, there's a 11 by 17, which if you print it in an 8.5 by 11 is tiny, that gets all into the different parts of it. So I will mostly ask for your questions, feedback, or what you would like to do with this. I'll remind you at the last meeting, excuse me, a couple ideas and concerns about how much of this we could do, and what does it mean to prioritize these, how much might they cost. Those are all good questions, and depending on what the commission would like to do, there's probably a few different answers to that.
Can I ask a question on the ranking before we get into
Sure.
how we're actually going to, what's the saying? How do you eat an elephant one bite at a time?
Yes.
So before we start talking about our bites, one of the major changes we requested was adding a score, an equity metric, and we used Wake Counties as a rough proxy. And I was just wondering, I know that a lot of the other scoring changed too, so this might be a complicated answer, but how did that change the ranking?
How did that change the ranking?
It looked to me like many stayed roughly in their same kind of at least quadrant, but there were a couple projects that shifted in score quite substantially.
Yeah, I think it affected some. On the scoring details sheet, the community vulnerability is the furthest to the right before your total score, and that vulnerability ranking is 3 out of the total potential 40 points. So it is, you know, a portion, just like speeds and crashes and other things are a portion. And I think you'll notice that the projects near the top, many of them have that 3, but at the same time, if you look at the projects at the bottom, there's a handful of those that have the 3. So I don't know that it shifted things drastically. One thing I would say is that there is a fair amount of correlation between community vulnerability and where the transit plan is directing resources in some places. There's certainly a correlation between the community vulnerability index and the MAP ED1 and the comp plan, which is the economic development target areas, for obvious reasons. So in some ways we double counted things a little bit by putting both of those in there. But the community vulnerability is a much smaller grained score based on census tract rather than the MAP ED1 is kind of
Lobby.
You're either in it or not. It is also based on census tract, but there's a little less to that, and it incorporates a lot of industrial area too. That is a different animal altogether.
Thank you.
So when I was chatting with the chair a little bit when the agenda first went out, and her questions tended towards, well, how much is this going to cost? And one of the things that I had suggested, I think I might have said it here last time, is that if the commission wanted us to do a little bit of work and come back with some more information about a subset of this, not all 35-ish projects, that's something we could do, I believe. And that would not be, functional designs. It would be a cost estimate that would be whether it's in the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, or tens of millions sort of thing. And we could talk a little bit about what prior planning in some of these areas, or in some cases the lack of prior planning, which creates a uncertainty of, well, what is that project really? The comp plan only says so much about some of these areas, so it's a little uncertain what we might do with these projects.
Before we make any recommendations, I think I tried to push a motion at last meeting that was premature. The idea was come back and get ranking. So now we have that. But I think before we make a full recommendation to council or prioritization, we probably need to add the financial aspect of this as well.
Would that be conventional practice for y'all? Or is that kind of different?
We have not historically done that like in the past when we've done bicycle and pedestrian projects and doing the programmatic rankings. We have not done dollar figures. The thing that's a little bit difficult, Jason, if you can hide the directory there.
Oh, I'm sorry. I've got this. I was up ready to put something else.
If you just look at the top 5 projects, there's a lot of variability in terms of what those projects are. So, for example, the top project with Avon Ferry Part 1 between Western and Varsity, per the Avon Ferry plan, that entails actually widening out and building a dedicated bus lane along that portion of Avon Ferry. So that's going to be a higher capital project than compared to the Blue Ridge District Study, which is going to be primarily doing sidewalk work and aesthetic components along both sides of the street through there. So they vary differently in scale. And as we move into funding, some of these, we've got some programmatic allocations for streetscapes that came from the last transportation bond, but for certain projects, they're large enough that we just fund them as independent projects in the capital improvement program, like Oberlin Road, for example. And then we also have the P Street West project that is moving toward construction now.
Right.
Just to help my fellow commissioners understand the order of magnitude, how much is the Oberlin Road budget?
It's like 2.6
million?
2.7 is what number sticks in my head.
Less than a mile.
Right. But that budget has changed because now there's some utility work being incorporated into it.
Yeah.
And so now the price
It's vastly dependent, but we're talking many millions of dollars on this list.
That's right.
And worthy, in my opinion, many millions of dollars. So.
Right. I'm almost wondering, you look like you're thinking, Robert. You got something? You're just thinking?
No, I'm thinking of those numbers, how many millions of dollars.
Many.
Well, I guess for me, as somebody who's very eager to see these very needed improvements come online and to see the time scale that they all take on, I don't know if there's a way to have your tiered approach of if every 5 years, hypothetically, we're going to implement a streetscaping array of projects, like if it was one of those, big kahunas, a middle, a mama bear and a baby bear, you know what I mean? And so we could have a broader distribution of assets across the city versus saying we're going to pursue our two $10 million streetscaping projects and it's going to take us 20 years to do. I'm just eager to see us find ways that we can be agile in the implementation of these while recognizing that to do something right, sometimes it just takes a lot of money. But also seeing that there are perhaps some things on here that are a different scale, and if that could be implemented in tandem with one, I'm struggling with, I just am struggling with the time scale of these.
And you shouldn't at this point.
Okay.
Really, the important thing is
Right.
that we have to prioritize.
Right.
Okay, and at some point, you got to pick which one's going to be the first project. And
Right.
that's what this process is really about. Did we get the top 5 projects right?
Mm-hmm.
And if we did, then those are the ones that we're going to pursue, looking
Right.
through our capital program, working with the city council. These are the ones that we're going to pursue for funding with council's approval, obviously. And just a reminder, this is the commission's recommendation to the city council, and it's done based on a ranking criteria that
Right.
the commission has developed. Once it gets to the city council table, the council can take that as a recommendation, but ultimately the council can say, we feel like project number 10 really is important, and that can be the top project. So
Right.
the scores are helpful in terms of helping us pick those priorities, but ultimately the city council has the final
Sure.
say. So again, from our standpoint, Avon Ferry has the advantage of already having had some significant community involvement with the corridor plan. P Street East, we've done some work out there 10 years ago, but we have to revisit quite a bit of that. Blue Ridge has a corridor plan in place. Hillsborough Part 6, that is one that is going to require a lot of community groundwork, and that one may require us to do some actual area planning first, because it's a sub-area of the Blue Ridge plan. The Westover community has some nuances to that section, and if you're out there right now, you also know that it's ground zero for State Fair. So that's a very different project that may require a different touch.
Right.
So again, this gives us the starting point. The reality is we're going to be gunning for how do we get these top projects done.
Sure, I hear that, and then I also hear the timescale thing again, right? Because you said that you did Peace Street, but it was 10 years ago now, and you got to circle back, or you did it. And so, how do we find more agile solutions where we can implement interim steps? Is there a way for us to be more agile in our? We had discussed potentially like a tactical approach where you had, street trees in the bucket, and that's an improvement in the interim, and it's certainly not your end goal, but it is kind of a tactical step to get us where we need to go, and it's different than we've approached it in the past. And I know that's not what this discussion's about. So
It's not, and there's only a few of these projects that would lend well to a tactical urbanism approach, frankly.
Okay.
I have a question, Jason.
Yes, sir.
Is there any way, in terms of how much money we might recommend, to compare our planning to what other similar cities our size has paid for such projects?
I mean, you compare how much they make into these types of investments?
How much did they spend, or how much?
Yeah, I think that's something we can do. I don't know the answer off the top of my head, but we could probably I imagine we could reach out to the city of Charlotte, for instance, and find out how much they invest in these types of projects. The thing that we have to spend a little bit of time on is making sure that we're comparing apples to apples and that we're not counting somebody else's oranges.
Well, that's why I said it the way I did. Is there any way to do it? There may not be. And I know, it's a different city.
Yeah.
But, other cities have upgraded, and
certainly.
And so maybe we can, and maybe at least some indication as sort of a guideline.
I would say that I kind of repeat what Eric said, is the ranking system doesn't make those decisions about how much we're going to invest in the program. That's City Council's budget process, and how, and if it's funded through transportation bonds or financed through transportation bonds, then it's the voters' decision on whether or not how big that bond should be. So we can do that back. We can provide that information. It may help provide some context here, and it might help the discussion about how we should fund these in the future. But
I don't know. I sort of easily see 25, 30 million for everything in some ways.
Easy.
Yeah.
I would, perhaps, I know that we have been talking about this for months. I don't want to cut off conversation, but perhaps that would be a suggestion we could make for staff to include in the report to City Council when we're presenting simply a methodology, right? Remember, we're not even choosing the ranking.
Right.
We are making a suggestion
Right.
to Council for their consideration. So perhaps they could include some information about kind of order of magnitude funding.
Yeah, and I think in the back of my head, I really like how that St. Albans Midtown plan did show you just a very, $4 out of $5, and you could just conceptualize at a community level what these investments, the level of buy-in that's needed.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's a part
Although each one of
of
those dollars was probably 10 million.
Right, and I don't think that's a part of this process. I'm just trying to think, how do we communicate this process as we continue it forward?
Okay, so we've had a methodology discussed and agreed upon.
Mhm.
We've got that methodology applied for rankings, which I suppose we can probably agree upon that, with jockeying a few positions here or there, probably the top 20 are valid priorities. And I recommend that instead of getting tied up in the funding, because we really don't know what the costs were going to be,
Right.
and the fact that there's a lot of other funding methodologies and council priorities that will come into effect, that we go ahead and recommend that the priorities that have been put together here in the rankings be taken forward to council. And I can put that in a motion if this is appropriate at this time.
And I would second that.
We're ready.
Does Ms. Woodall have a question or a
No.
comment? Okay.
Sorry.
All right.
We have a motion and
I
a
thought we
second.
scared you off there for a second, Jason.
Do you need to ask us for a vote?
Yes, can we take a vote on that?
Yeah, so you have a motion and a second?
Okay, so I have
Discussion?
Any discussion further?
any other discussion? I need like a little earpiece. All in favor.
Aye.
All right. I don't need to pound anything, do I? Okay. And now we are going to move on to our final item of the evening. Jed, if you wouldn't mind giving us an update on the PED signal upgrades.
I grabbed the wrong one. I thought I was being helpful.
Hey, before he does that,
Uh-oh.
this is sort of an aside. We
Give them a
said
second
something
to give us
about
the
the council person, was it Stewart? And giving us, having us to rewrite something more in an advisory way. Was that ever done? And did she get back to us on that?
Was that something that was in the pedestrian subcommittee?
I believe he is referring to our work program this year, which
Yeah.
had a brief conversation with Counselor Crowder.
Crowder, it's
where-
Crowder.
That's right, where we talked about our role as an advisory body and making sure that we're phrasing our work program as such. But I think that we're all on the same page on that. so
Yeah.
that's good.
The
Okay.
council approved the modifications that were made.
All right, okay.
Moving on?
Well, get this started or hit the button. Start with a little levity. I've followed Jason Harden in his beautiful presentations numerous times. So I'd like to thank Jason Myers for bringing me back to a
Spreadsheet.
With no presentation, I think he was saying.
to a reasonable presentation. Let me see. Sorry, usually I hit the button, don't I?
No, you see slideshow top where?
Oh, yeah, sorry. All right, my name is Jed Niffenegger. Thank you for having me. I know some of you very well, some of you a little bit, and some of you are new faces. I'm a city traffic engineer, and I'd be happy to talk about LPIs. And just as a FYI, if you ever want to learn more about anything to do with biker peds or traffic engineer, I'd be happy to come back and talk to you. So with that, talk a little bit about leading pedestrian intervals. I know you mentioned turning into a pumpkin at 7:30, so trying to be cognizant about your time. Who here is familiar with LPIs?
Oh.
All right, well, I'll blow through this. Typical practice I have up on the screen is to run the pedestrian movement concurrent with the same vehicular movement. What happens is when you have right turning vehicles or left turning vehicles, this is a one-way street, or in this case here, you get potential conflicts and issues. depending upon how many peds, I mean, you go some areas where there's not much pedestrian activity, it's not an issue, but specifically in downtown and in some other pedestrian-heavy areas, it can be very problematic. So LPI, you know what that is. And the premise behind it is it gives anywhere from 3 to 7 seconds. I actually noticed on Fayetteville Street today, I walked very quick, but the walk indication, I almost cleared Martin Street before it released the vehicular flow. So we generally run 3 to 7 seconds, and it allows the pedestrian to establish themselves in the crosswalk so before vehicles are released. And I removed it from the presentation. Someone else did it for me, and I kind of changed it around. New York really took this very strong, and I think they're up to 20% of their signals have LPIs, and they've noticed a 40% reduction in crashes, which you got to be careful saying that because you don't have a crystal ball. You don't know what crashes are going to occur, but I know that they are very effective, and there's something I can get to. There's something that we're going to be rolling out a lot more. I'll get to that later on in the presentation. Again, how they work, they're either, downtown's not actuated, but in other areas they're actuated. You hit the button, and this clearly shows that vehicles are still going on the opposite, let's say 4 and 8, and this movement has the steady red hand. The next slide.
That is not good.
Next slide shows a walk indication, but if you notice, the vehicular signal head still shows a red, which allows the pedestrians to get out there before. Our concern would be the vehicles coming up here turning a right, or depending upon the setup, coming back and turning to the left and conflicting with the pedestrian movement. And then you get the green indication. Let me see, I think we have a video. Oh, we removed it, that's right, it was too big. It gets quite a bit more complicated. Downtown, it works real easy when you have two-phase signals, meaning that you have one-way street and another way street. When you have stuff like, we did this for a school where you have a protected left turn. So what we did is, it takes a lot more work when we, not so much in the design, but when we roll it out in the field, where it will hold this red indication, but it will release the non-conflicting movement, again, for 3 to 7 seconds, somewhere in that. In this case, the kids and the crossing guards will get established in the crosswalk before the vehicle movement is let loose.
So can I ask a quick question on that? Would that go to flashing yellow or to green?
Well, that was a 3-section head. I had an example of a flashing yellow.
Okay.
A good example would be a flashing yellow head. We would not, we had a video of one, but it was too large of a file. It would hold the flashing yellow in red until the pedestrians got established.
Okay.
Sorry, that was a 3-section flashing. It wasn't protected all the way because you can't run protected with the PEDs.
Okay.
So it would have flashed yellow, which is a permissive movement. When they get a gap, they could turn.
Okay, so after.
Even when they had permission to go, it would never turn fully green.
It would go to flashing
It would just
yellow.
only flash yellow.
You will never
Flash
have a
yellow
green,
or red.
we will never allow a green arrow with a conflicting PED movement.
Okay, that's what I wanted to know. Thank you.
And that's a very good point. One of the things we're running into is we're going through some of these capital improvement projects, even working with DOT. A lot of the locations that we've dealt with have dual left turns, and that is the worst thing in the world for a PEG because you have you have dual threat movement. So NCDOT actually, the engineer that's over the central region has really gone to a lot of classes and really progressive in terms of, for DOT, but he's really progressive in terms of not allowing that or coming up with some alternative phasing to minimize that. We have about 30 locations right now where we're running them. Fayetteville Street was the first one we ran them. We're running them at generally super high ped activity locations. Blue Ridge and Macon Pond was one that I was heavily involved in. There was a shift change where when they did the Rex Hospital, they put the employee parking across the street, which didn't go over well with the employees because they had to cross Blue Ridge. So what happened was when the shift change occurred, you had some people that were parked on inside, and then you had all the people trying to leave conflicting with the PED. So we went out there and we implemented an LPI, and the state didn't want it running all the time, so it was kind of like a time of day LPI, I believe. And we have not heard any chatter one way or another. Usually we only hear chatter if if there's a problem. So we seem to fix that one. We recently installed 20 on the Salisbury and Wilmington Street corridor. So for future installations, my division has a goal. We kind of set up a goal, a multi-pronged goal of how to improve pedestrian accommodations everywhere, but focusing predominantly on the downtown area and a few other heavy pedestrian areas. For the downtown one, the first one was a while back we got a project to make sure all the signals have pedestrian signal heads. We're also going to upgrade all the crosswalks to high vis, but would also like LPIs in all locations in the commercial business district. And part of that is a learned behavior. If pedestrians come up to one and expect it, I don't want a pedestrian stepping out and not getting an LPI and putting themselves at risk. So kind of the uphill battle that we're going to face is all government, is the cost to do it. We have to pay about $1,000 for plans. The good news is we have 2 engineers with PEs that we just hired that seem willing, and if they have the time, maybe they can do that so we can roll out some more a little quicker. The other is NCDOT requires state approval. In the past, when we did Salisbury and Wilmington, DOT made us commit that we would not adjust the vehicular timing on Morgan and Edenton. As long as we dinged or took the time from the city's network, they were fine with it. We're going to push here hard to have them do Dawson and McDowell and Edenton and Morgan.
For the PED interval? For the PED interval?
For the LPIs.
Okay.
Right now, their current division traffic engineer isn't there, so that might be an opportune time for me to ask. So I will be asking here shortly. That would be, again, something the state would probably look at the city to incur the cost of the design.
Can you talk a tiny bit more about that, how there's a burden to make it more pedestrian oriented, a financial burden? Is there, why? I mean, it seems like if we wanted to encourage safety, we would have the burden be on the faster vehicular travel that's killing people versus the retrofit to make it. And why isn't this standard, having an LPI?
Right.
Why isn't, and sorry, I see the confusion on your face. Why isn't it standard practice to have this installed versus having to retroactively add it?
Part of it is a lot of, especially, I don't want to talk about the broader area, but Raleigh in specific was, a lot of the infrastructure was designed around vehicle-centric mode of transportation. We're pushing to make it like Fayetteville Street, for example. We did LPIs, we didn't need state approval for that. There were more pedestrian activity than vehicles. I mean, we're supposed to...
So the $1,000 increment per plan is to show that there's sufficient pedestrian flow in order to do it?
The $1,000 is actually to hire a design firm to do the plan.
Okay.
I'm not sure if I'm answering your question.
Yeah, you are.
Part of it is it's a relatively new treatment. And as it's gaining in popularity, as it's shown to be an effective, proven countermeasure, you will likely see it in more places as a standard.
Okay.
The problem with just, to your point, blanket doing it everywhere is cost, because we maintain 650 intersections, and if it's 1,000 each, the cost would be significant. But some locations have very, very, very light pedestrian traffic, and others have very heavy, so we'd be rather be a little bit more tactical about it and pick the high return on investment locations first and use what limited funds we have to get the most bang for the buck.
It would be interesting, and maybe this goes back into our conversations about the street design manual, where new intersections are created, like when you build a Wegmans or a hospital expansion, in places where you can anticipate a fairly high pedestrian volume, that those intersections, the lights could be, the intersection could be designed and installed with LPIs from the beginning.
Very good point. I had a meeting today with Wake County for the school up there on Strickland Road. Is it West Millbrook, I believe? And I requested they put a LPI because the intersection geometry wasn't ideal. So that's something that me and my staff are pushing more and more.
Okay. Is that something that would be in the street design manual? Eric, Jed, do you guys know? Intersection design is not in the street design manual.
Intersection design components are as far as the toolbox, but signal measures are not. So prescribing signal operation, that's not part of the.
So they provide the hardware, you provide the software and the operational. Okay.
And to Eric's point, of the 650 signals we maintain, probably close to 500 are DOTs. So we couldn't have a design manual that told DOT how they have to design their signals.
They might not take kindly. Anyways, just a thought. Thank you. This is great.
Any other questions? I'd be happy to entertain.
Well, I just have maybe you mentioned this. Has it been demonstrated that these LPIs cut down, save lives? You know, cuts down on accidents?
I did a little research. I wanted to check the highway safety manual and see what the crash modification factor was. I didn't get a chance to do it, but Manhattan did a massive amount, over I think 2,000 of them, and they've seen a 40% reduction in bicycle and pedestrian crashes at those locations. Again, I just read it. I don't know the scope of their study, but it is a relatively accepted, proven safety countermeasure.
I'm glad to see it's implementing them. Thanks.
How do we determine what intersections get a crossing signal, a pedestrian crossing signal?
Well, right now our current work plan is we just did Salisbury and Wilmington because we didn't need DOT approval. The ones that intersected their street, I kind of alluded to that earlier. We'd like to get the heaviest pedestrian areas, like I think our next one is Glenwood South, and I'm trying to think.
You mean just crosswalks?
Yeah,
in general?
I'm taking a step back, and what signalized intersections in general get a pedestrian crossing signal at all?
My goal is to have all 650 have all quadrants signalized, marked with high vis.
Okay.
One of the challenges we have with DOT as a policy in place, that if there's not infrastructure to receive pedestrians on the other side of the street, that they will not allow us to install pedestrian hardware at that point.
It comes down to ADA guidelines.
Okay. What do you have triggers that will implement a phase design review where you systematically look at something? Is it timed every so often, or AADT reaches a certain level where you're just going to look at the phase design for a certain intersection regardless of whether you're concerned about an LPI or not?
We do what's called turn and movement counts. We try and do every signalized intersection every 2 years. We'd like to increase that frequency. And what we look at is see if the number of pedestrians have increased, see if like a right turn or left turn movement have increased. And we look at, use that data to help drive maybe moving forward with a new signal plan. For example, a protected left turn, a LPI, something along the lines of that. So we proactively look at that.
Okay. I'm going down my list here. I apologize. I'd love to see bicycles be allowed to move with the LPI. Mm-hmm. Is that a state or a city policy that would have to change to allow that to happen?
That's a state law issue.
Yeah.
Because right now, if it's a red light for all vehicles.
And a bike is classified as a vehicle.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I'm like.
I mean, if you got off your bike and walked it across, but that defeats the purpose of riding the bike.
That's what DOT wants us to do anyway.
Right, I think a lot of other states, maybe, could we just do a little bit of research into that to understand? I think bikes are ubiquitously considered a vehicle.
Yeah.
I mean, nationally, I don't know of a state where
Correct.
they're not considered a vehicle, and there are many states that do have a placard underneath the LPI, underneath the walk signal that just says bike proceeds with pedestrian, and the bike proceeds through, so that they have the same ability to
Be interesting
take
to
advantage.
understand.
I believe that
What
would
would need to
require.
change?
Right, so that's what I'm just curious on if it is
Statutory.
because they're a vehicle, then how have other states circumvented that? You know what I mean?
I'm not an attorney and can't answer that question for you.
Okay, well, maybe that's something the bike subcommittee could just dabble
don't
in.
even play
It's
one on
not like it's
TV.
pressing, I'm just curious.
I mean, if you go out to Colorado, the culture out there is a lot.
So I got
Political culture is a lot-
change, is that what you're telling me?
Uh,
I got time for that?
I think it probably would require state statute to allow something like that.
And my last question,
Spokes advocacy.
specifically at Six Forks in Dartmouth, right there, the North Hills, big crossing there, the shopping center. I heard a rumor that there was an LPI that had been tested out. Is that correct? Have we looked at that intersection for an LPI?
I know that is one that I know that my staff has talked about that. I know that is a location, another high, we want to do Cameron Village to downtown, North Hills, Hillsborough Street, the very high pet activity areas first. I know that's one. I can follow back and let you know for sure where that stands. I don't know off the top of my head, I'm sorry.
I'm also interested in the Lassiter crossing. I don't know if that's under your purview as well. It's a signalized crossing with a traffic signal.
Yeah,
but
it's
not
right
a-
there at the, coming out, I guess, of the shopping center to the north.
Yes.
I think we installed a LPI if we,
Well, it's not really an LPI because it's only it's a full traffic signal just for a crosswalk. So there is no concurrent
Oh, that's
automobile
right.
traffic.
That's right, it's a
The
pedestrian.
phase design recently changed, and I
Yes.
was wondering what triggered that change.
Yeah.
And it seemed to be a negative change from the pedestrian point of view.
All right, this is,
All right.
you're the pedestrian advocacy group. We get very flavorful calls and emails from drivers about how horrible that situation was. My staff made an adjustment which they thought was minor, and now we're getting some feedback from your constituents that saying it was too much. So we'll probably go back and move the needle. You can't make everyone win, so the goal is to find a place where everyone can kind of coexist, so to speak. I think, unfortunately, we moved it a little bit too far.
Okay. I'd like to say that was a wonderful crossing.
Yes.
It's still not bad, but it is less wonderful.
I agree with you. Based on some of the emails I've seen, I think we can move it back maybe towards, maybe not quite wonderful, but towards that direction. How's that?
I'm okay with compromise.
Yeah.
All right, how are y'all feeling about this? Any other thoughts or concerns?
I think it's great.
Yeah, me too.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you for your work on
Thank
this.
you, Jen.
Yes.
Carry on.
Any board comments?
I have two very, 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 very quick ones. I won't be a minute, but it kind of segues from what we were just talking about. One was I happened to visit Fredericksburg, Virginia, which is a small town of 25,000 people, but it's very evident they have no intention of having pedestrians be hit.
Nice.
That town is on it. There is a lot of pedestrian improvement in that town. So if you're going through, I think they probably have a lot of tourism, a lot of strangers in town, and you are not mistaken in knowing what you are to do when there's a pedestrian. So that was good. The
I
other-
missed the town name, I'm sorry.
Fredericksburg, Virginia.
Excellent.
Yeah, go to the historic town. Well, all of it, the whole town. I was very impressed. It's a small town. The other thing is on August 19th, several of us in the room attended the FHWA Bikeway Selection Guide Workshop. And I would just like to, I'm going to probably say this at every meeting from now on, just so you can be aware. But one of the points was the goals. And the first FHWA goal was to increase the number of short trips made by bicycling and walking by 30% by 2025.
I like it.
And then the second one was to reduce pedestrian and bicycle fatalities by 80% in 15 years and to 0 in 20 to 30 years. So I guess my point is, if this is a Federal Highway Administration's goals, I would really love to see the city of Raleigh have similar goals. You know, I know state of North Carolina's been working on Vision Zero, a lot of different communities are. I just think that was a really big takeaway from that meeting, and I hadn't been to the meeting since then, so I brought it for you tonight.
Thanks for remembering. I would have forgotten that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, setting goals means you're trying to achieve them, and so I think our work plan did not include a goal quite that direct. I would like for us to be much more direct in our intent.
That may be giving more than advice, I don't know, but okay.
Well, I would advise that we start thinking about the Federal Highway Administration's goals for the future in terms of how we're moving forward. And, you know, we've talked about this a lot. So
Yeah.
I'll keep finding these, and I'm going to bring one every month.
What was that first one you said?
Increasing short trips made by bicycling, walking 30% by 2025, and that is, of course, just a few years away.
I like it.
Any other board comments? Any upcoming events?
I tend to get this one. I've given the details to Rena, so I'm just reading this into the record. Don't forget, our last Walktober event is this Sunday, October 27th, the Oakwood Cemetery Tour, which is a lot of fun, 6 p.m. at the cemetery entrance on Oakwood Avenue. This coming weekend, there are 5 races in Raleigh. There's a Day of the Dead 5K that runs to Oakwood Cemetery, popular place this weekend. The Juvenile Diabetes Walk is at Walnut Creek Amphitheater, and there's a Prevent Child Abuse called 5 Factors 5K at Dix Park at Harvey Hill. Then the following weekend, those of you who are runners or participate in that, want to be in downtown Raleigh. Those of you who don't should not be, because the City of Oaks Marathon is Sunday, November 3rd. Remember, it's not just the City of Oaks Marathon, it's the UNC Rex Healthcare Half Marathon, the Old Reliable 10K, and the Acorn 5K. So that all starts at the NC State Bell Tower on Hillsborough Street at 7 a.m. and pretty much has got that area of the city between Cameron Village and down to Western Boulevard blocked all morning on Sunday. Also, the long runners will run along the House Creek Greenway and the Mine Creek Greenway as well. So lots of good running events in the fall here. Hopefully now the weather's cool and there'll be a good time for all. Thank you.
I have 3 public meetings for the Commission's awareness. First, in October 29th, the Newbern Avenue BRT project is going forward for its next public meeting. That'll be at 4 p.m. at Martin Street Baptist Church. On November 6th, there is a larger Wake Transit community meeting. That'll be at 4 p.m. at Raleigh Union Station. And then on November 7th, we have our next Capitol Boulevard North corridor plan. You heard that mentioned earlier by Jason Harden, and that is the portion of Capitol from 440 to 540. And that'll be at the City of Raleigh Central Ops Facility up on Westinghouse. And that's also at 4 o'clock.
Awesome. I actually do have 3 events too, sorry. October 23rd is Oaks and Spokes Open House, so that's the bicycle advocacy organization for Raleigh. It's going to be, oh gosh, I can't remember the location. I'll send it to you, okay, for the notes. October 28th, Oaks and Spokes is also co-hosting an event with Transfer. It's going to be a bike and movie on cargo bikes called Motherload. Please do come. It's going to be very fun. You can test ride my cargo bike if you'd like, or Fontaine's. And November 3rd is a ride with Oaks and Spokes as well, from Kiwanis Parks to the new Wegmans, which is only 1.3 miles on the Greenway. Did you know? With a short little stint on Industrial Drive. So that will be a fun way to show the 5 Points region how they can get to Wegmans using their bicycle.
The Oaks and Spokes open house is at Cavis Community Center.
Thank you. Thank you. On the 23rd. Okay, are we all done? Great. Let's go. Shall we? Adjourn? Do I have to second that or anything? Or do we just do it? Adjourn.